Hi, I'm Brett Robinson. I'm on the pastoral team at Gymea Baptist Church. In our series in Exodus, titled Set Free to Follow God, we are up to Exodus chapter 20 and the 10 Commandments. Normally, we would have a sermon that explains the text and its application for us. Today, Mark will be taking us through the passage from the perspective of a character within the passage. In this case, Moses. This is known as a first-person narrative. You might want to have your Bibles open as you follow along. Let us prepare our hearts to hear the word of the Lord now.
It's a long climb to the summit. And to be honest, I don't really remember much of the ascent. I was far too preoccupied with what we had just experienced and far too worried about how the people had responded. We had arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai 3 months to the day after we had come out of Egypt, as the Lord had promised. We camped at the foot of the mountain, and shortly after that, the Lord had called to me and told me to speak some remarkable words to the children of Israel. These were the words that He told me to say. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I brought you to myself, carrying you on eagle's wings. And now, if you will fully obey me and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be for me my treasured possession. Though the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a royal priesthood and a holy nation. This was unlike anything that I had ever been asked to speak. These were not instructions for us to follow, nor were they a declaration of intent of what God intended to do. This was an invitation to each of us to enter into a relationship with Him, a covenant relationship with Him, where the Lord would be our God and we would be His people. It's remarkable. Has anything like this ever happened? No. And if that wasn't remarkable enough, well, after the people had accepted this invitation, the Lord told us to prepare, for He was going to descend onto the mountain and we would hear His voice speak. And so we prepared. I consecrated the people and on the third day led them to the foot of the mountain to meet with God. And it was overwhelming. And I have had some experience of a close encounter with the Lord. I stood on this very mountain barefoot on holy ground as the angel of the Lord called me and sent me to Egypt. I have heard His voice on numerous occasions and conveyed those words to my brother Aaron or to Pharaoh or to the people of Israel themselves. And while I would not say that I am familiar with the ways of the Lord, for His ways are not our ways, His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, His voice at least is not unfamiliar to me. But for the people, they had seen His mighty acts of power. They had seen me hold the staff of God aloft, and they had seen and witnessed the impact of that, but they had never seen the hand that performed those deeds. For them, as they gathered at the foot of the mountain, this was like seeing the wind. And as they stood at the foot of the mountain, the summit was covered in dark cloud. The whole mountain began to smoke like a furnace. There was lightning, there was rumbles of thunder, and the whole mountain began to shake. And over all of that, growing steadily louder and louder, a sound like a trumpet or like rushing waters. And the Lord spoke to us from the storm. But He didn't speak to us. collectively, as if we were listening in on his own thoughts. He spoke to us individually, to each and every person who stood assembled before him. To every woman who stood at the foot of that mountain, the Lord spoke directly to her. To every man who stood before the Lord that day, the Lord spoke directly to him. To every girl and boy and slave and foreigner who had cast their lot in with the Lord and with his people, the Lord spoke directly to them, inviting each of them to respond, inviting each of them into a relationship with him. And so their response to that invitation was worrying to me. And it wasn't just their response, it was their response to what the Lord had said to them. For hear the words of the Lord. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And in that one simple sentence, the Lord had summarized our entire history with him. Everything that had happened to us was contained in that phrase, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. It reminded us of his protection against the Amalekites and his provision of food and water in the wilderness, and of his mighty act of salvation in burying the Egyptians in the sea after we had crossed through on dry ground. It spoke of his guidance in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. It reminded us of the angel of death passing over our homes while all the firstborn children across Egypt died. It spoke of the darkness that descended everywhere except where we lived. It spoke of hail. It spoke of boils. It spoke of flies and frogs and blood. It spoke of bricks without straw. It spoke of the mourning of mothers, the loss of their infant sons cast into the Nile River. It spoke of harsh and bitter labor. It spoke of crying out and of being heard. For our story with the Lord did not begin in Egypt, but began with a promise. A promise that had been given to Abraham, calling him out of his land and away from his home, away from his gods, to the land of Canaan. A promise that declared that his descendants would become more numerous than the stars. A promise that declared that those who blessed Abraham would experience the blessing of God, and that those who opposed him would experience the opposition of the Lord. A promise that declared that his descendants would bless all nations. A promise that led to the birth of Isaac, to an elderly couple with no children and well beyond the days of childbearing. A promise that followed Jacob from Bethel to Haran and back. A promise that went with Joseph into the land of Egypt, sold as a slave but sent by God, under whose favor and through whose wisdom provided not only for his family but for all nations. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And with that history sitting before us, he then spoke these words. You shall have no other gods before me. And not you collectively, but you, and you, and you, and all of you. You will have no other gods before me. And you, and you, and you. You will make no images, nor bow down and worship them. And you, and you, and you, and all of you shall not misrepresent and misuse my name. And you, and you, and you, and all of you remember the Sabbath. Keep it holy and do no work on it. And you, and you, and you, and all of you honor your mother and your father. And all of you do not kill. And all of you do not steal. And all of you do not commit adultery. And all of you speak truthfully, and every single one of you do not covet anything that belongs to another. 10 words. 10 declarations that speak of the character of the Lord, the one with whom we were about to enter into relationship, the one and only God, besides whom there can be no other. The God who is so great and mighty and all-powerful that he could never be contained in an idol or an image. The one who is so great, so just, so loving, so compassionate, so holy, so righteous, that he is worthy of all honor that can be given to him. The God who created the entire world, all that is seen and all that is unseen, in the heavens above and the earth beneath, and who rested on the seventh day. The Father, from whom all families in heaven and on earth derive their name. The God who provides for his people. The God who ordained that a man should leave his mother and his father and be joined to his wife, and that none shall separate them. The God who has given life to all, and who has written all of our days in his book of life. The one who is himself truth and always speaks truth. And the one whose generosity is evident to all, as he causes his sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous, his rain to fall on the good and the bad. 10 declarations of the character of God. And do you begin to see why I was worried for the people? Because these are not laws. This is not legislation. They are not nearly specific enough. There are no consequences for failure. There are no exceptions or precedents stated. These are statements of the character of God and call forth a response of character. This is not about what we are supposed to do, but who we are supposed to be. And that is worrying, is it not? How, for instance, do you legislate against covetousness? When does admiration of another, their position or their possessions, their husband or their wife, their influence or their status, when does admiration slide into envy? And how is that envy played out in our lives? Speaking truth, I suppose, can be measured in some regard, but ultimately those words come from our hearts. And are our hearts so committed to truth that we will speak truth not only when it is easy to do so, but when it is hard to do so? Are we so committed to truth that we will speak truth impartially, not allowing someone's status, their wealth, their influence, their power to influence the way in which we speak of them? Theft. Theft sounds easy enough to figure out, but what about the greed that so often leads to theft? Not only the greed that I have in my heart that causes me to steal and take, but the greed that leads so many to take so much, leaving so many with so little, that they are forced to theft. Is it enough that we stay out of one another's marriage beds if our hearts are filled with lustful thoughts and desires? Is it enough that we do not leave a trail of bodies behind us if our hearts are filled with hatred and rage and anger? How do we honor our parents? Because when we are young, it is different to how we honor them when we are adults, and different again to when they are old and frail. Is keeping the Sabbath day holy simply a matter of figuring out your physical exertion, looking at the prohibited activities and only doing those that are allowed? Or is there a posture of spirit that rests before the Lord, regardless of what we do? And do we represent His name if all we think about are the externals? Do we represent the Lord if all we are concerned with is what we are to do, not with who we are? Is idolatry only in the external, or is there not an idolatry of the heart? An idolatry of the heart that finds it so difficult to trust the Lord, so difficult to only turn to Him, so difficult to allow Him to be mysterious instead of seeking to constrain and contain and box Him in. And do you see now why I was so worried for the people? Because their response to this once-in-a-lifetime, never to be repeated, utterly unique invitation of God to enter into a relationship with Him and to be His people, their response was worrying. Because their hearts are not right. Their hearts are not right. This is the people who, days after we had seen and witnessed the powerful act of God's salvation on the shores of the Red Sea, days after they had seen this and witnessed His power and greatness, at the first hint of trouble or hardship, had immediately began to grumble and complain, calling into question God's intentions towards us, wondering if, instead of seeking to rescue us, He was actually trying to kill us. Some wanted to return to Egypt. These are not hearts that are given over to the Lord. And their response, I fear, came from those hard hearts. Because when the Lord had finished speaking all these words, they said to me, "You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let the Lord speak to us, or we will die." They were not filled with awe. They were not filled with wonder. They were not led to worship. They did not feel compelled to step closer to the Lord. Instead, their reaction was one of fear, of stepping back and away from God, of wanting distance from Him. And as I realized this, my words to them were, "Do not be afraid. The Lord has come to test you, so that the fear and respect and awe of Him will keep you from sinning." And I believe those words, but as I ascended the mountain, I kept coming back to whether or not that would be enough. Is it enough for this people to have heard the voice of God, to have seen the representation of Him in the storm? Is it enough to change their hearts? Is it enough for this people to recall the acts of God's salvation? Is it enough for this people to have seen the fulfillment of His promises? Is that going to be enough to change their hearts? No. And I almost went down the mountain to say to the people, "You cannot become the Lord's people. Your hearts are not right. They are hard and they are stubborn and they are set against Him. They are not set to follow His ways. And if you are about to enter into a unique, special relationship where the Lord will be your God, He will demand all of you. And you do not want to give Him your hearts now. And that will be disastrous. It will be a disaster if you do that. You are unworthy and undeserving. The best that we can say is that we have been recipients to this point of God's faithfulness and of His graciousness, swept up in His promises and plans. And as I rehearsed that, as I listened to myself, I realized that that's actually the point, isn't it? We have always, only, ever been recipients of God's grace and mercy. We have only, always, ever been swept up in His plans, in His purposes, and in His promises. We have never been worthy. When I think of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you don't have to look very far in their stories to see evidence of hearts that were not fully set on following the Lord. Lying, cheating, murder, immorality, greed and lust and envy. It's all there. And nothing has changed. Our hearts are still not set on following the Lord. And yet surely He knows that. Will it be enough to have heard the voice of God to change our hearts? No. Will it be enough to remember His faithfulness to change our hearts? No. Will it be enough? No. Nothing will be enough to change our hearts. But will it matter that it's not enough? And I realized that the response that I had accused the people of Israel of had become mine. I had responded in fear and a desire to withdraw from the Lord. Fear based on our imperfections. A desire to withdraw in order to remain a safe distance from God. And yet, we have always only ever been recipients of God's mercy and grace and faithfulness. And if He has been faithful to this point, to provide and to care for our needs of food and water and protection and guidance, then can He also be trusted to provide what we really need? A new heart. And the response of the people that had preoccupied me as I climbed, the response of the people that was, do not speak to us again, perhaps is not the right response. Because when the Lord first invited the people into relationship, they had a very different response. And on that day, they said, "We will do everything the Lord has said." And I wonder if that statement of intent, a desire to do what the Lord has said, I wonder if that, in the hands of a faithful, loving, compassionate, promise-keeping God, might not be enough for this relationship to work. If we respond in fear, if we respond in withdrawal, for whatever reason, we miss out on the glorious, unique, remarkable relationship with the Lord. And we, you, me, you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and all of us have always, only, ever been recipients of His grace and mercy, swept up in His plans and purposes. It's a long road to the summit. But as I make the final approach, I come not with fear, but with eagerness and trust to hear what the gracious, compassionate, promise-keeping God has to say to you and to me, His people. His people.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
We hope you've enjoyed today's program. Remember, you are always only the recipient of God's mercy, grace, and faithfulness, who is swept up in all of His promises and purposes. We hope you've enjoyed today's program, and we look forward to seeing you next time.